Hello and welcome to the Coffee House Writers Group. This is normally the part of the podcast where I would say just welcome and go straight into the music, but I thought it would be appropriate to address the tragedy that occurred, what is so far being referred to as the mass shooting or massacre in Orlando at a gay nightclub. I don't script any of this, although I do think about what I have to say beforehand in any part of the podcast. And everything that you will hear after the music plays was recorded before this took place. And it just so happened one of the topics we ended up talking about was writing LGBT characters, even though this podcast is about young adult fiction, because LGBTQ plus people are not relegated to a specific genre. They are our coworkers, our family, our friends, our fellow Americans, and most importantly, our fellow human beings. Instead of going into a commentary like you've probably heard on a late night show, I want to be specific to my audience right now, writers and creatives. It just so happens that I ended up talking about in the intro just to come that the purpose of art is starting a conversation, and I can't see how that would apply more than it would right now. As writers, poets, people who reach out with the pen, we are some of those people who exist to win hearts and minds. So please think about what you're going to write and why you're going to write it. And I suggest that you write with purpose. Now please enjoy the podcast. Okay, we'll get to my conversation with Cory Rasmussen in a minute. We are going to talk about the popular young adult YA genre, or whether it's a genre or not, whether it fits into another category. It's very popular right now, not something that I personally choose to write, that he has been writing it for a while, and I asked him why he chose to write about that. We have a lot of things that we can choose to write from. There's really as many options as there are books. Not just genres, but topics and combinations of. There's really endless possibilities of combinations of words or not. I want to get too mathematical about it, but that's the way it works. So what we choose to write. Yeah, but the point of writing is going to be similar to the point of art, because writing is art if you have done it at any competent level. And the point of art, it seems to me, is starting a conversation. The point of art is to start a conversation. And to that, you have to drive across some sort of point, something that sparks this conversation that turns into a roaring flame and maybe kindles a national debate or something. That's when you know you've definitely done something right, is when you've got people talking. Whether or not what you're trying to say is bad or good. If you get people talking about something, considering something that seemed mundane to them before even, that's something is really worth striving for. You gotta provoke. If art fails to provoke, then it fails to deliver its point. And you have to convey across the right message for that. And that's something where I think that contemporary art tends to fail at. When you're walking through a museum and you see a pair of glasses on the ground without any displays or anything, and you're wondering, is this an exhibit? Or this pair of shoes, it just looks like a pair of shoes. Is that an exhibit? What is the point of the painting of the Campbell's painting of a can? And if everybody gets something different out of it, then you have not done something right. Because then all of the work comes from the eye that the person is viewing it from, or ears or whatever. And then, so you're not being the artist, you're making them work for the art. And to me, that's not really art at all. It's just say, hey, I'm going to challenge your mind for a little bit into construing what I created here as some work of art. And that you're not going to get a conversation started with that. Because when one person says something and the other is like, I thought it was a parakeet. When you thought this was about oceans. Or, it just goes nowhere. If it goes nowhere, then your art has gone nowhere. But if you're writing something, generally you're writing to entertain and probably to sell and make profits and whatnot. So a lot of times you just have to sneak in your point. And that's the part that makes it art. You don't hit your reader over the head with it, because then they're not continuing to read. And unless they finish, enjoy, want to share, and want to communicate your work, then your art isn't really going anywhere. So you have to succeed on many levels as a writer to make what you put down on the page a work of good art, of art that does what it's meant to do. Because you can make anything and call it art, whether or not it succeeds. Just like, if you write, then you're a writer. That's just whether you're good or not, whether you write children's books or you wrote War and Peace, it's just, you're a writer then. But whether or not you succeed is what makes you an author. And so that's to me kind of like what art is about. So we definitely can't get too high on ourselves and delude, and because that's when we kind of lose the point, when we're all up in our own head and we're thinking that we're conveying the same message over the other person and they're going to think the same things you are. Because no matter how good of an artist or writer you are, they're not going to be 100%. But if you get a majority of people within the ballpark to start talking, that's what I think you should be going for. So in order to make sure that we're getting across what we mean to get across, and that our work is being conveyed, the way we wanted it to be, we could go to critique groups. Hey, did you know Coffee House Writers Groups does critique groups via meetup.com? Go to meetup.com/Coffee House Writers Group /Coffee House Writers Group Long Beach for a group in Long Beach, Coffee House Writers Group Anaheim for a group in Anaheim. Go to one of those. Highly recommend it. Speaking of our critique groups, let's go back to where we're going to be talking about today with Cory. Cory has read his entire novel, Sandstorm, or / Rock, Paper, Scissors, I guess was his working title. I'm not sure whether he's decided or not, but we'll see when it happens, because it's good. He read the whole thing in small sections through a course of a few months, and I'm very proud of him for having both completed his novel and for sharing it and making it a decent one, making it pretty good. And he's still got edits to go. I know by the time he's done, it will be a great novel. So I'm pretty confident with him, and was very happy to have him here today. So let's go ahead into the conversation. We're going to be talking about young adult fiction, the struggles of writing in young adult fiction, whether or not your narrator or character whose point of view you're coming from has that young adult voice, what the young adult audience is going for, what makes it young adult versus new adult, or another genre, or wherever you place it, what makes it that thing, and what really defines the genre, or whatever we're going to call it. So here's my conversation with Cory. So you write young adult?
I do. I write poetry in young adult. My poetry usually isn't reflected on a young adult audience. I think that's kind of interesting. But yeah, I would prefer to write young adult stories versus adult stories.
Why is that?
I love the idea of the coming of age story. I noticed that books that I like to read, movies that I like to watch, they have this idea of the impressionable, teenage youth and, coming to terms with whatever, asset of their life they're struggling with. And I find that really interesting. And I teach adolescents, I teach high school English. And so I'm used to kind of that, those students and their daily lives. And so that's just kind of what interests me and helps me become a better teacher.
So it's something that you're having around you all the time, so you figure this is what you can write about it?
Right, exactly. So, I see all kinds of students. I mean, the student body is very diverse, even in Huntington Beach. And, interacting with the various students, it gives me a lot of material that I could then use my own creative mind to then create stories.
Frame of reference. I grew up in Northern California, so there was a predominantly white, somewhat Hispanic, very few Black and Asian kids. What is it like in Huntington Beach?
It depends on the school. We have several schools in our district, and each school is a little bit different. The particular school that I work at, it's interesting that while we are predominantly white, we have other subgroups that are increasing. So although white is the majority, our school does play to a diverse crowd, especially from students who are coming from other schools in the area that may not be in the bestest of areas.
And is it like a middle class sort of upbringing that your kids are coming from?
Well, we're near the harbor, so we get quite a mix. We get middle class, we get lower class, and we also get upper class. And so I love that, our students are diverse, because diversity allows people to grow better and people to see a bigger picture of the world around them instead of being in a, quote, Huntington Beach bubble.
Yeah, so when you're writing your young adult fiction, do you draw from that diverse crowd? Do you hone in on a specific aspect of young adult life, or do you just pick from all parts and lots of it?
I think it depends on what the thematic piece that I want to write about is. Like, what's the bigger picture of the writing? I'm not just going to write a story to tell, the mundane life of a teenager. If your audience is going to be predominantly teenagers, they experience that. They want to know something else. They want to kind of learn about a piece of themselves, or they want to, explore things that they can't explore, outside of maybe their homes or whatnot, if they have an alcoholic father or whatever the case may be. I tend to focus on like the GLBTQ plus kind of subgroup in my writing. They're kind of disenfranchised when it comes to writing and works, and there's a lot of great authors out there, but I think the market is heavily saturated with vampires and dystopian kind of aspects, and so I think we need a lot more kind of modern, realistic, albeit maybe magical realism, young adult pieces.
So you consider young adult to be teenagers? From what age range?
Young adult is such an undefined kind of term. In my opinion, I see young adult as late middle school to exiting high school and getting into college, because then you have new adult, which is a new genre that's kind of making its way through the marketplace, and you have, picture books in elementary school. So young adult for me is like middle school, late middle school, and then all throughout high school. However, the readership of young adult is way beyond that. There are a lot of adults who read young adult as well.
Yeah, exactly. There's not exactly enough 12 to 18-year-olds buying books that are going to support giant franchises like Hunger Games and Twilight, I guess.
And if you look at the makeup of the audiences for like the Twilight series, for instance, there are a lot of moms who were just excited in opening nights of purchasing, the Twilight series. I worked at Borders for 4 years, and on our Harry Potter nights, when we released a Harry Potter book, I mean, the adults were just excited as the kids were. So even though it's classified as young adult, that's not really the genre, I would say. That's just kind of like the age bracket, and even that is kind of not a set boundary.
I understand that Harry Potter was young adult, but it never really went into that neat little genre for me in my mind. One, because the readership I associated with it is definitely different than the typical young adult audience. And I didn't get it from my peers. I got it from full-grown adults. And I went to the last book launch party over at Borders when Borders still existed. And it was really just huge. There were a lot of kids, but most people there were adults. And it never felt like it fell neatly into that category for me. It was more fantasy than anything.
Well, I would agree. I would say that fantasy is the genre, of Harry Potter. However, it's young adult not to be seen as necessarily a genre, because fantasy is a genre, but young adult is kind of the target age bracket. When J.K. Rowling was creating the story and writing the story, I don't think she had in her mind that she wanted to specifically write to adults. I think she had a story to tell about this young orphan boy who has been given this gift, and she wanted to convey that to, younger audiences, and it just took off with the older market.
Yeah, the way I heard it, she originally just told it to her kids before bed and then decided to write it down. I may be completely off, but that's what I heard.
I heard something similar to that too, and I think that's how most good stories starts, and good storytellers, start with being able to orally tell stories to people and then being able to transcribe that down onto paper.
So young adult is more of a target age range than it is a genre. So what we think of as mainstream young adult, when it's not in something that falls neatly into a genre like Twilight or like Hunger Games. More like a John Green novel that is more lit fic for young adults.
Yeah, because you go into a Barnes & Noble and look at the young adult section, and it's not classified as high on young adults. You have the new release, obviously, but then you have science fiction, fantasy. You have love interest. They have a love interest section. They have a nonfiction section, which is actually becoming increasingly popular, nonfiction pieces. And there's other kind of sub-genres within the young adult grouping of books.
In a bookstore, I'm trying to imagine one now. Because I get my books digitally now, not always, but mostly. And I'm picturing a regular science fiction section and a young adult one, as opposed to just a young adult section with all of the genres thrown in, right?
Right. So they're separated, and fantasy and science fiction are usually thrown together in the young adult sections of bookstores. That, I believe, is somewhat similar. I remember working at Borders, I think our fantasy science fiction was also thrown together. For some reason, Suits think that it's like these two things that are
all
drastically the same.
All speculative fiction is the same.
Right, that you're fighting elves in one day and you can be like shooting laser beams at someone another day when they're completely two separate genres. But oftentimes bookstores do kind of throw them together, as with young adult.
So what do you think moves one book from the young adult section of any genre to just the plain one without the YA tag?
That's a good question, because if you look, I believe Perks of a Wallflower, very popular with young adult and adult audiences. It follows the life of a protagonist who is a teenager, and yet for many years it was marketed just as an adult book. In fact, when I worked at Borders, it could be found in the regular adult section, not the young adult section. But its popularity with young adults kind of pushed it more to, hey, this is a great young adult read, and yet I think we still categorized it in the adult section. Look at Holden Caulfield in, The Catcher in the Rye. Follows an adolescent voice who has complete teenage angst, right? And yet he's also categorized as adult and not young adult. So I think it's the way that publishers market the book and the way that the book is marketed more so than just it has a teenage audience, then it must be young adult.
In Perks of a Wallflower, it has a lot of themes of drugs and sex, heavy drugs. There's a lot. The kid takes acid at a couple points, and the things you come up against are very adult issues. Do you think maybe that's what's pushing forwards? That it's maybe they thought it wasn't acceptable for younger audiences? Or is it maybe on some level of respect that, hey, you're good enough to not be YA? Sometimes I feel like people think like that.
Yeah, I find that interesting. I don't necessarily think it has to deal with themes, bigger issue themes that maybe are dark. I mean, look at the Harry Potter series. It starts off as very innocent, and the tone becomes gradually darker with each book.
Yes.
You have books that deal with, students and teenagers in mental facilities for attempted suicide. You have alcoholic and abusive parents. I mean, these themes do appear in young adult books as well. I think it's just the way that the book is marketed. Take another book that doesn't really have dark themes, but The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, which is a really amazing book following this autistic child and his voice. That book is marketed as an adult book, and yet it's very popular, and often schools teach that book to students, or offer it to students, especially in communities where maybe students might be a little bit socially awkward or, not know how to socially respond to other people. So I don't know. I don't think it's the thematic element that puts it in the adult versus the non-adult section. And I don't think even now you can say it's the literary merit of the piece. You have John Green, who's a fantastic writer.
Fantastic writer.
And his pieces are extremely literary. And adolescents kind of like to read a little bit above kind of their intellect level. So when we talk about voice and you talk about adolescent voice, sometimes his characters don't necessarily sound like adolescents, but it's believable and you still buy it because you're connected and hooked onto the story itself. And that's literary. A lot of his pieces are literary, and yet that's in the young adult section.
What you just said about reading above their intellect level, I think it's also about their age level. I remember as a kid, TV shows, books, whatever have you, you're reading about a character that's maybe 2 years older than you at all times. That you're never, if you were a 13-year-old, you're not reading about 13-year-olds because those are targeted for kids that are younger than 13. And for a book about 16-year-olds is generally about people younger than 16.
Right. I've read a study where I think the conclusion is that adolescents do like to read of the age of someone a little bit older than they are, which is interesting because once you get to adulthood and you're reading young adult, you're quite, older than
go in the opposite direction.
Right. You go in the opposite direction. But yeah, so if you're 13, for instance, you would want to kind of preview, what's coming up in your life or the themes or whatnot. And if you feel that you're on the fringe of a particular social group or you are struggling to find out your identity, it makes more sense then to read a book of someone kind of like you're reading the narrative of an older brother or sister and you're kind of following your older brother or sister in with the protagonist of the story.
It's weird some of the decisions they make with marketing and who people are writing in mind for. Because back in the day, graphic novels, then comic books were only for kids. Mm-hmm. Now that readership has grown up, they are marketed specifically for adults. In many cases, they'll plaster a big giant sticker that says, kids do not read this. Black Adam is tearing people literally in half. And there are moments of sex and violence, and Captain America will deal with very dark themes at times.
I think it's playing to that childhood nostalgia of adults, and they realize that people will buy comic books and graphic novels and books that are targeted for a younger audience. So you're noticing now a lot more of those books being more adult-centered, yet having younger protagonists or the cartoonish kind of aspect. I mean, look at Deadpool. What is it? One of the first rated R Marvel movies that there is, and yet it made lots of money, more than people thought. A lot of people thought it was going to flop because of the rated R, and yet people were flocking to it because it's that humor and that comedy and that, it's still kind of the superhero genre, and yet it's darker and it's twisted and it's vulgar.
It had a very rabid audience that was very hungry for it, and it got nothing but positive press the entire time. Its ad campaigns were brilliant. It really anchored itself in the comics, and he's a more of a fresh character. In the early 90s, I think he was, and he just had a lot of underground popularity that word of mouth really spread him. So I'm worried that a lot of people will take the wrong lessons from Deadpool, just, hey, we have a superhero movie, oh, let's make it rated R, or let's just really amp up the humor, but that's not the best for every movie.
Right, it served a purpose in Deadpool's case.
Yeah, it filled a void that wasn't filled.
And that's why I think when you're thinking about writing young adult, I think you need to really think about the audience that is going to be the majority audience that is reading your piece. Do you want just teenagers to read it? Do you want adults and teenagers to appreciate it? It's kind of like the Disney Pixar films that you go and you see and you enjoy them as an adult for the childhood nostalgia, but at the same time there are jokes that that the kids aren't getting, and it also appeals to adults.
Not even just childhood nostalgia, but at a great intellectual level, a whole lot of them. Toy Story 2 is one of my favorites, and that whole thing was about immortality that was not as great versus death, which were very intellectual themes in this movie.
Right, so I think the same could be said for, young adult novels. If you want to write, usually the more commercially successful young adult novels are the ones that have the themes that adults can understand, whereas teenagers might not understand them completely because they have limited experience, but they're still aware of them and they still enjoy the story. Yeah,
in a story that works on multiple fronts.
Correct. And going back to the audience thing, you just need to know your audience. For instance, I read a book called Press Play by Eric Devine. And there's a simplistic kind of young adult voice style in it. And yet at the same time, the simplicity of it makes it an enjoyable read. For instance, one passage, it says, "Quinn is quiet the whole ride in this morning. Doesn't say a word about yesterday, which I appreciate. What he's doing for me and now Ollie is pretty awesome." And it's about an individual who's struggling with his weight, and he is being coached by this other guy who is very athletic. And it's like those two versus the entire lacrosse team, because the lacrosse team, there's a bunch of jerks. And so it's clear that the audience readership is going to be male. And so you notice, because Devine notes that, he makes it so that it's easily digestible and easily to understand.
So when we're just talking YA, that's probably too broad to nail down in a specific audience. Depends on how broad you want your readership to be. But are you trying to appeal to the disenfranchised YA people that are targets of racism? Are you targeting the popular kids, the jocks, the people who have parental problems at home?
Yeah.
So do you think that applies to this piece that you're mentioning?
I think it does. And I think you have to think about the socioeconomic and the education level of the people that you're writing for. And if you want to get at a group that maybe, education can't be the first thing valued in the household because both parents work 3 jobs and, it's just not the priority, and working is a priority, and, that exists. And if you want your protagonist to be relatable, in that way, then you have to make sure that that protagonist's speech kind of reflects that community, that aspect of that family.
How do you go about tackling the YA voice?
Well, I listen a lot. So at school, and I don't listen a lot as in I'm talking with students, because obviously there's going to be a filter there. I leave my classroom door open during lunch and I grade. And while I'm grading, I kind of keep an ear out for conversations of students that filter in, walking across campus. I listen to what teenagers say to each other about a variety of different topics and how they respond, how sometimes it is very insightful and very sophisticated, and oftentimes it's very, sophomoric and very childish and foolish. And that's the whole spectrum of the young adult voice. And you can find novels that clearly focused on, the slang and the lingo of certain kind of groups within a school. And then on the other side, you have very sophisticated kind of bookworm speech.
When you're writing a character and multiple characters, do you try to incorporate both, or do you focus on one over the other?
I try to, incorporate both. If the character is going to be smart, like the character in my novel, Sandstorm, Maverick is a little edgy and a little, off-putting, but at the same time, he's very smart, and he doesn't convey this smartness to other people, but as a reader in the internal voice, you can see it. And I kind of set that up as the backstory of his mother before she passed away, kind of educated him, instilled in him, the importance of words and the importance of language and how to communicate with people. And I think if you do that successfully, then you could have a character who maybe would be disenfranchised or maybe not what you would expect to be, sophisticated in speech, and it would still be believable. Right now, a young adult novel that's getting a lot of press is I'll Give You the Sun, and it's very literary. It's by Jandy Nelson. And what I liked about that piece was she was able to go back and forth between a high literary level and style, and then ground you and remind you that these are teenagers. I believe in the snippet that I've brought, the one part doesn't quite sound like a 13-year-old. And in fact, I kind of struggled with this throughout the book because I kept having to remind myself that he was 13 because he didn't speak like a 13-year-old. The kind of function and purpose of that was that the parents were both very professional and very literary themselves. So as a reader, you assume that that's been instilled in them. But for instance, this description doesn't seem like a 13-year-old. It says, "We walk and walk through the gray, ashy dusk, and the forest starts to fall asleep. The trees lie down side by side. The creek halts. The plants sink back into the earth. The animals switch places with their shadows, and then so do we." It may seem simplistic, but the metaphors and the imagery there is quite literary and quite figurative. And then she juxtaposes that with, later on, a description of the same 13-year-old saying, "Both classes so far, there's been a real live naked girl with missile boobs sitting on a platform." And so the description of the boobs as missile boobs kind of reminds you, oh yeah, he's 13. But that book is winning a lot of awards, and it seems like the young adult books that tend to win awards are the ones that kind of strive for this literary aspect and try to incorporate figurative language and metaphors. And will all of them be absorbed by the teenage audience? Maybe, maybe not. But for the adults that are reading it, I think it will. And so it kind of goes back to that Pixar, Disney picture kind of thing of, can it be enjoyable for both adults and teenagers?
When you're thinking of that voice, you're getting into a teenaged head. Do you just go based off of what you absorb now as an adult, or you try to go back and remember what it was like then?
Well, we were all teenagers once. We all had that, confusing with our, aspect with our hormones going crazy. And I do mix. I go back to like things that I would have said and would have done, and kind of balance that with what I hear now, because speech patterns and lingo kind of change from time to time. Though I would caution including slang in a young adult voice. Words that were popular a couple years ago, like YOLO. Kids don't say that anymore. So Let's say you're working on a manuscript and you have a kid be like, oh, YOLO. It's probably going to be edited out because no one says that anymore. Things like ratchet or yeet, like last year, very popular was yeet.
I completely missed that one.
It's kind of like an expression, like something happens or like, whoa. It's a synonym for whoa in a lot of ways. But even now, like that was so popular last year and now no one says yeet. And so, you have to be careful with slang. But you just think back to when you were a kid and think about the things that you would say with your friends and how that tone would be different with your friends versus your teacher versus your grandparents. And you try to hone in on that.
Do you think it has to be modern? In Perks of a Wallflower, that takes place in the 80s, I remember. So that's more of when the author himself was having his own childhood, so he's obviously drawing from that.
Right. It would depend if you wanted to make a time period piece or not. A lot of authors feel comfortable writing what they know, and so they might want to set, like for me, it would be setting a novel in the late 90s, early 2000s. It just depends on what time period you want to write in, because whatever time period you write in, you're restricted by obviously the technology of the time period, what was popular at the time period. So if you have that, the voice of your teenage self in your brain is very clear and very vivid, maybe go for it and write a timepiece of that era. But just note that that voice might not be the same voice of teenagers nowadays.
If you're trying to write one now, if you're trying to take your past experiences maybe, or things that you see that are modern, you're trying to tell some sort of story that means something and apply it to today, want to really reach kids today. Do you ignore your past self, or do you still incorporate parts of it?
No, I think you need to incorporate parts of it. I think you need to incorporate kind of the emotional aspect of it. You need to, when you create a character, you're kind of breathing life into this fictional person. And you, in a lot of ways, the little pieces of you get put into that person. And so how would you respond in situations? And then, but you just have to be careful, because ultimately you want it to become not how would you respond to these situations, but how would this character that you created, who has his or her own faults and, and strengths, how would they respond?
Something else I think is great to think about are struggles that we now as adults face that are not age specific, that teenagers are also dealing with the same problems that I'm dealing with now, just because of the era in which we live. We have smartphones and people less likely to connect. We have all sorts of things, the internet constantly growing what we are able to experience, and therefore what people do experience and what they take away, what's easy, what's harder than it was back then, what's easier than it was back then. So do you think that's a good idea, to incorporate things that are happening now as an adult and implant them in, or are we getting too much in the adult head?
We want to be careful that we're not preaching themes to teenagers. Once your voice turns into here's the lesson, here's the moral, I'm telling you what this book is about, you're going to lose your teenage reader, because you want to trick them, and they know that they're being tricked, but you don't want to tell them specifically that this isn't an idea that you should have.
For Eric was here before. His podcast is already up by the time people are listening to this. He talks about Mark Twain and how he kind of tricked people into his lesson that, hey, black people are okay. Pretty much is the idea.
Yeah, you want to do that for young adults. If if you wrap it up in a bow and say, here's this moral that you need to take away, or you need to treat people this way, or, it's okay to be this, they're going to see right through that. They're smarter than you think. And so you want to make sure that you create a piece that is authentic to their voice, that is authentic to their lifestyle, but at the same time, they can absorb the themes, and they can absorb, look at very popular, The Fault in Our Stars, right? This idea of mortality and this idea of falling into oblivion. I mean, it's very clear that the idea of having an adolescent think about death and ponder this idea of existing and not existing. And it's a very dark and a very scary thing, but at the same time, John Green does a very good job with not drilling it into their head, live each day that you can and enjoy each day and have magical moments like the champagne scene, when they're in Amsterdam, but just live. And that's kind of conveyed throughout the novel rather than just, John Green telling readers specifically, you're going to die, so make sure that you live.
Who really doesn't think about that at any age, that we all have mortality once you learn that people are going to die? I mean, I've thought about death all the time as a kid, and quite a bit. But now that as an adult, things that I've gone through, my grandfather's death was very significant to me, did change my perspective on a lot of things and affected what I do now today. Those things are different. So it's really just the same ideas developing through time. And one other great thing about YA, I think, is that we have characters that are going through their transformative years. And in great pieces of fiction, we have characters change. And I think that sets it up really well, just the age of this is when characters are supposed to change. So if you have them change in the book, that feels very natural.
Right, this idea of the dynamic character versus the static character. A lot of good young adult pieces have characters that are dynamically changed and, change either their mentality about specific issues or, maybe in my book, for example, Maverick is very homophobic, but then in experiences causes him to, realize that people are just people and, people are there to help you in certain ways and help you learn pieces of yourself and learn pieces of just humanity in general. But I think that's the purpose of the young adult story, is that these teenagers and adolescents, they have limited experience. And so as an adult writing the piece, you can kind of foreshadow, if you will, this idea of the experience that they may receive in the future and let them know that, things get better. Keeping in mind that even though they have limited experience, whatever the character, the protagonist is struggling with, that character would know the terminology of, what they're struggling with. So for example, like in The Fault in Our Stars, the protagonists are very aware of different terms for cancer, what types of cancer, the treatments. And so the medical jargon,
they would be.
Right. So the medical jargon that is used in the book is very relevant and the characters would know. If someone is checked into a mental institution and with a bunch of other teenagers or whatnot, they're going to know different psychological terms that the psychologist may have used with them or whatnot. And so that creates that authentic voice. And so while they have limited experience, depending on what you're writing about, there are going to be teenagers who have more life experience in a lot of ways, tragically, than a lot of adults.
Areas, yeah, I mean, a lot of kids I did not go through poverty. A lot of kids, unfortunately, do. So they're going to have experiences that I still have not had and hopefully will never have. So when you're writing young adult fiction, why are you writing it? Do you think when you're, maybe not exactly when you're in the process of writing, but when you're gathering up all your horsemen at the gates to break down that writer's block wall, what are you striving to do?
I'm striving to write a story that I would have enjoyed when I was a teenager. I'm striving to write and tell a tale of, the struggle and the pitfalls that all teenagers are going to fall into. A lot of them think they're invisible, but they're not. Humans aren't invisible. We have mortality. And I want to write stories that err on the side of teaching them about caution and teaching them about rational voice and thinking things through and making decisions. And some decisions may seem like the right one in, the short term, but the long term, there are consequences to that. And I think because a lot of young adult, readers have that limited experience like we were talking about, I think it's very important to write stories that kind of convey these messages to them naturally and kind of give them a little bit of experience of adulthood into the life of a teenager and something that you would enjoy following along with the story. Because readers want to enjoy the story. You pick up a book, you start reading, you don't want to fight against it. You don't want to not. You can fight against characters and you can hate characters and you can be angry about the scenarios, but you want to enjoy the journey that the author is taking you on. And if you can create this authentic voice of a young adult, I think it makes the story more impactful and more believable.
When I am presenting to the group a piece of fiction that has a 17-year-old and 18-year-old as the predominant voice, they'll often say, "Oh, so it's YA." And I'm like, no. I did not write this for young adults, and God help teenagers who do read this book. Should I take offense to that? Or is there, if I want to not be a part of that, is there something I do to get away from it?
I don't think you should take offense to it. I think that if you want to convey that it's not a young adult novel, you just make the other parts of that are outside of that character, make sure it's clear that it's not young adult. One of my favorite movies when I was a kid was Terminator. Was it Terminator? No, it was RoboCop. I'm getting my robotics mixed up. It was RoboCop 2. And, that's why, because the two kid characters are both kind of, foul-mouthed in RoboCop 2 and Terminator 2. Both movies I really enjoyed. And here was a kid character, and just because a kid character is in it doesn't make it young adult. They say some atrocious things. And yet it's clear that both those movies are very adult movies. There are tons of movies that have, teenagers in them. Just because the teenager's in a story doesn't mean that it is a young adult story. I think the focus, are you focusing on the young adult story of the story, or are you focusing on the other character's story of the story? Or are you, how are you creating your universe? How are you setting up? Does most of it, I've watched some movies, where it takes place in a classroom, high school classroom, but the focus point is on the teacher, like Bad Teacher, those kind of movies. And it's clear that it's not a young adult thing. So I think it's just how you tread the different aspects of the other characters and don't focalize on the young adult.
It's a lot of time how we get angry parents at the theater who did not read the description and say, "Oh, there's a kid in this. Oh, there's animals in this. It must be for kids. It's
right.
Animated. It must be for kids."
Exactly.
We talked a lot about the voice. What are the other big struggles in young adult fiction? Or is that pretty much it?
That's one that I get feedback on first the most often is, on one of my novels, it doesn't sound like a young adult.
So that's what people say when they're saying, giving you their best constructive criticism that they can? That it doesn't sound like one?
That's one of the first things that is said, which is interesting because I have some students who are beta readers and, I say, "Hey, I'm working on a story if you'd like to come during lunch and, read a chapter or two," that they don't say that at all. So I find that interesting that I get that criticism from adults and not kids. I guess other aspects are just try not to be cliche. Like how many redheaded best friends can you have?
How many pretty ugly girls can you have?
Right. Is the jock going to fall in love with the nerd and she looks really nerdy and dorky, but as soon as she takes off her glasses, like everyone starts noticing her.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so you have to be careful with the cliches in the young adult kind of section because kids don't want to write read cliches.
So the best young adult examples that I assume that you read a lot of young adult. I've read fairly little. I've read John Green, I've read works of Paul Flower and stuff like that. What do you try to extrapolate from them? The ones you consider really great?
I mostly look at their style. David Levithan is an excellent author, and the style that he has is sometimes literary, sometimes, simplistic, but you enjoy the story nevertheless. And so I really look at the style. If I could write like John Green, that would be the epitome of like what I would want to achieve to do because I think he is so great with his style. A very popular book that's kind of older in the GLBTQ plus community is called Geography Club.
I'm sorry, so why do you drop the L Because you're seeing G.
Oh, it's probably just a type, Spico.
Okay.
GLBTQ plus.
So you're doing G before the L. And I'm just
LG.
And I'm not hearing the L because I always hear the L first.
Right.
LGBTQ.
Yeah, I better make sure I do the L first. LGBTQ plus book, Brent Hartinger's Geography Club. Because of the simplistic language, but just the enjoyable kind of feelings of going back to, childhood. One of his parts in the book, the character is about to kiss another character, and that's something that adults can relate to if you're going on a date or even teenagers. But the way that it's described, Hardinger writes, "Then we kissed. Her face was in shadow, so our mouths kind of missed at first, but then we made contact. Her lips were warm and squishy, like overcooked asparagus, and it freaked me out a little, but at least there were no tongues involved." Like, I could picture the same reaction in an adult going on a date and kissing someone you don't want to kiss, and yet the throwing in of the overcooked asparagus kind of brings back the readership to the young adult audience.
Yeah, your metaphors, the way you relate to it is maybe a little different.
Right.
Maybe some crude in areas that are more classical than crude as opposed to something that you picked up as you go along.
Right. And instead of it being hypersexualized, it's more kind of childish and whimsical.
You're focusing more on that disenfranchisement than, say, racism or other parts. Nerdism gets, I guess, attacked a lot, if that's a word.
Well, racism, I want to be careful about what I write. If I were to write about racism being, Caucasian male, The Help sold hundreds of copies, yet it got a lot of criticism and flack for being a book about a certain experience of the African American community written by a Caucasian, a white person. So I don't have a lot of experience in racism from the other side, so I'm not going to write what I don't know.
But you have experience in the LGBTQ plus community.
Correct. And so writing about, the struggles of growing up, the struggles of trying to find your identity in a society that constantly tells you that you're wrong and you don't feel this way and you're making this up.
Do you think people that are not actively involved or attach themselves to one of those letters, as in I don't, do you think that someone who doesn't fall into any of those categories should still feel okay to write with that being one of the themes of the book, if not the main theme of the book? You can.
But you have to be very careful that your characters don't become caricatures of that particular movement or that community or subgroup, which is why I don't necessarily would write focusing on racism, because I wouldn't want my African American characters to become a stereotype or caricature as I'm trying to convey a very heartfelt message. I wouldn't want the danger of that. But you are in that community because it's part of the plus, it's everything else, and so even allies count in that community. So it would be interesting you could write a story where there's differing perspectives, and one of your characters is straight and one is gay, and I think just write what you know and investigate and learn from the other stuff, but just be careful that the character doesn't become a caricature.
How did you go about writing Sandstorm, which was the full-length novel that you read from end to end throughout many weeks and sessions at the Long Beach Coffee House Writers Group critique meeting? It was great to hear the whole thing, by the way. Great to have you there for that long.
Thank you.
How did you go about starting that through the process from the perspective that this was going to be a YA book?
Well, I had the idea, how would a teenager react if he learned that the person that he looked up to was nothing what he thought? And then so that's how I made Colton, the Marine that he corresponds with, gay, whereas Maverick, the teenager, is completely straight. And so I wanted to see how that relationship could develop. However, I didn't start the story there. That comes in towards the middle, because I wanted you to experience why Maverick was the way that he was and throw him into his kind of chaotic world. And then that's how the beginning part of the book took place. But essentially the story is about friendship, and is about finding a mentor, and is about learning from other people, and you don't have to be afraid to learn from people who aren't completely like you. And in fact, it's very important that you learn from people who are different than you, because you may be focusing on just ideas that are in your bubble and you may not see in the big picture that is the world. And so I thought it was very important for Maverick's story to be quite different than Colton's story, and then have them meet through the emails online, and then what would happen if he put his trust into this individual only to learn that this individual isn't what he thought it was, and did it even matter to begin with?
Yeah.
Right. He only assumed it.
That's great. So in the great struggles of YA fiction, Maverick is a very smart character. How do you write a smart young adult without making him just be an adult?
One of the ways in which I write Maverick as a smart character without making him an adult, or like an adult reflecting back to his childhood days, kind of like a Stand By Me, Stephen King, The Body story, is this idea that you kind of ground his metaphors and his responses to what's happening in his life and make sure that those aspects are of a young adult nature. In one of the chapters, his girlfriend throws him a surprise party at a hotel in Las Vegas at the Treasure Island Casino. Obviously, that party would be completely different if it was an adult party versus a teenage party. So I made sure that I grounded it in the idea that brought the PlayStation along, and they're excited about, the pizza they ordered. Instead of, room service of dinner, they just ordered pizza and brought the pizza up. And so the little images and the reflections of life, you want those reflections to be of an adolescent rather than of an adult.
Yeah, their alcohol is more just like, alcohol, yay, as opposed to, I want the IPA, please.
Right. Or, you brought these 2 bottles without any mixers. Where's the cranberry juice? Where's the orange juice? I mean, I think the character that brings alcohol and shows up with alcohol, he has a bottle of tequila and a bottle of vodka because it's the only thing that they had, and they drink both of them at the same time. And so as adults, you kind of know that that's not going to end well. But with teenagers, I mean, it's alcohol, and alcohol is kind of like this umbrella term of just drinking.
That's the thing that matters.
Right.
That's cool. And is it the same thing for drugs? I mean, not that I remember in Sandstorm, but there weren't much drugs in it.
No, there wasn't many drug references, if at all, I think, in Sandstorm. There were so many other issues I wanted to tackle. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you have to pick and choose because you obviously don't want to oversaturate with, here's a book with all the struggles that teenagers deal with nowadays, because then it just becomes a afternoon special type
one of those
show.
Or not even just to preach, but to convey YA life realistically. And a lot of people will say, yes, this is the epitome of the teenage struggle, but we all have different ones. I never had a big drug problem that a lot of people end up going through, and I didn't go to those giant ass parties that are in every movie, teenage thing. So there's different ones. So when you're writing one, you think that you say, this is the type of person that had this sort of YA life, and not just all YA lives are the same.
Unless your character is a complete train wreck, like we're talking like Misha Barton OC train wreck, then you can explore everything. But I just didn't feel like drugs was needed in Sandstorm. I mean, there are pot references, and there are a couple of times when Maverick's close friend Dante, they smoke pot, but that's about it. And alcohol, even though it shows up in that scene, isn't predominantly, the book isn't about alcohol, so I'm not going to put alcohol in every single chapter or page.
Right. When you're having a character in front of you, and you're developing a relationship with the character, and you have to because you're the writer, do you think about what they're going to be when they're an older character, or are they just in that moment? Sometimes I will, after I've gone through everything I've gone through, I will sometimes see a child, and I will see how that child reacts, and I'm say, this child is going to be this kind of adult. I'm pretty sure. I mean, obviously not destined for that. And it's more of like people watching you make up stories about them. But do you think about that?
I do. I worry about some of my characters. I wonder what their lives are going to be like. That's why there's kind of the epilogue that kind of strays away from the typical kind of YA story. Usually there's not an epilogue in young adult novels. I mean, Harry Potter did it. And I think Twilight...
Those fans would have gone nuts asking for her what was going to happen after. I think it's like, okay, calm down. This is what's going to happen. I'll give you in the actual book so you're not hounding me on the internet for years.
Right, but your characters do become a piece of you, and you breathe life into them. And I don't have any children, so they're kind of like my literary children in a way. And so yeah, I think about it a lot and when you write the character, you want to set it up so that it can shift and turn, and their character direction isn't solid. Because who wants to read a story where you identify the character on page 1 and you know this character is going to be the same throughout the entire book? Nobody wants to read that story, because people aren't that way. So yeah, I wonder what happens to them at the end of the book, past the book, and then is there room for a sequel? Are you going to write a sequel or that kind of thing? And sometimes it's just not needed. Sometimes you just want to allow your reader, if they enjoyed your story and they enjoyed the story that you had to tell, you allow the reader to kind of make up, the ending from there, from where you leave it.
Why did you end up having such an affinity for this age group? You're a teacher, you write YA. What has brought you back to this age range and saying, I want to be a part of these people's lives?
I've always loved reading and writing, but I think it was my experience when I was a sophomore in high school, and it was my teenage experience of writing, and that's where I kind of really started to find my voice, that I became a writer, a beginning writer, because my voice obviously wasn't matured, as a teenager, but at that age. And so I've always wanted to help kind of pass the torch, if you will, to other students who might be interested in writing as well. I remember from 7th grade to all the way through leaving college, from Cal State Long Beach, every summer I kept a journal that I wrote in every single day. From going from
that'd be
6 to
interesting
7.
to read nowadays, I bet, right?
Yeah, very interesting. And so I've always liked to write, and so because the hobby of writing became so important in my lifetime during this period, I think that's why I've kind of stuck on it for educating and teaching and helping students write, as well as creating characters in this time period.
Right, and you're an English teacher, right?
Yes, I'm an English teacher. I teach our school sophomore year focuses on world literature, so we read a variety of stories from around the world.
Does your perspective as now a writer change what kind of books you would like to present to your students and say, we can learn from these books? Do you not get to choose, maybe? No,
we do get to choose. Our district gives us, as long as we're professional about it, our district does give us, freedom to explore different reading options. I look for books that are very thematic and that can be attractive to, teenagers. One of the most popular books that I teach is Cyrano de Bergerac, the French play by Rostand, and the idea of insecurities and not being able to tell the person that you like them. I think those are themes that resonate really well with a young adult audience, even though the adults, they're protagonist adults in the play. With my sophomores, I read The Kite Runner. Next year, I'm going to be teaching The Alchemist. And so I do try to include stories that I think that they would enjoy, that have both literary merit, but at the same time, they have themes and issues that teenagers can appreciate and relate to.
What kind of things did you read as a kid that made you want to go into this field?
Oh, my favorite thing was every other weekend, my dad would pick me up and drive me to Oceanside, where he lived in Oceanside. And one of the things that we did every other weekend was we would go to the bookstore, and I could select a book, for him to buy me. And I would read that book on the way back from Oceanside to Lakewood at the time, and I would finish it in the time period in the car. And the book of choice was always R.L. Stine's Goosebump books. I was fascinated with R.L. Stine Goosebump books. I couldn't get enough of them, and that turned into the Fear Street series and his more kind of, teenage books. But those were the books that really kept me reading as a kid and instilled in me the sense of passion for writing and reading.
What are the books that keep you going now to read?
Anything by John Green, anything by David Levithan. I look at what's popular, what the kids are reading, and check them out. Sometimes they're hits, sometimes they're misses, because what's popular is not always what's good. I enjoy books that tell story. Yeah, I enjoy young adult books that tell stories that maybe I haven't necessarily experienced, or just seeing kind of love blossom between two characters in a kind of childish way. I think that's kind of takes you back a little bit, and it's kind of funny.
Is young adult your favorite genre?
Young adult is my favorite genre. I read a lot of young adult. I think it helps me be a better teacher. It keeps me on my toes for recommendations. However, my recommendations aren't always young adult based. A book that I read last year that I really loved was Ready Player One, and one of the students in my class kind of seems like he would fit that readership of that book, and so I recommended that book to them. And so that way, the more I read too, the more I can recommend books to my students.
You're like the teacher in Perks of the Wallflower. Hey, read this book now. Read this book now.
Well, right now my students are writing their magical realism short stories, so I've taught them what magical realism is. Oh. We've read a couple of short stories by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and they have to, based on a picture book of The Mysteries of Harris Burdick, which I think is the same illustrator. The author is the same illustrator as Jumanji. They choose a scene and then create their own kind of short story. And so it's our creative writing unit. And I tell them that the piece has to be 8 to 12 pages long, and they freak out. And I said, don't worry, you're going to be emailing me, asking me if it could be longer, and sure enough, I do. But one of the ways that I start the introduction to their story is we read from the prose. I'm doing air quotes. I forget that there's no camera, so I'm going to read from the prose. And so I pull various young adult books off my shelf, and we read just the first page of those young adult books. And so that way, the students in the class could see different ways that authors start. And like one of the books, for instance, is Keeping You a Secret. It's a YA book about a girl who falls for another girl in school. And I know that there's this girl in my class who has been questioning her identity and has kind of responded in a couple of ways on worksheets and stuff about this. And so after class, I approached her because I had a copy of the book, and I said, hey, would you be interested? I know you've commented a couple times on worksheets and whatnot. Would you be interested in reading this over spring break? And she absolutely went for it and snatched at it and took the book. And I even subbed her class for the next period, on my conference period. And when there was downtime, I noticed she pulled out the book and started reading it. And I think that's like the greatest kind of feeling in the world, is that you recommend a book for someone and, they start reading it, and maybe they like it, maybe they don't, but you kind of lead them in that direction. And the only way you can do that is if you read YA voraciously. That
is great. For people are constantly recommending, when they hear what I read, they'll recommend a science fiction or fantasy, something from back before I was born, because books don't go away unless they're burnt or lost to the sands of time in general. And when I read more of any genre and somebody comes to group and there's like, hey, what is like this? Or people will recommend things, and it'll generally help people around. So with young adult, just for offering that to young adults, it's good to have a selection to pick from.
Right, because I don't want to, I heard this book was good, you should check out this book, because it could be a book that is not good at all, or is not authentic, or has, horrible themes in it. But I want to make sure that when I recommend a book to a student, I've read the book myself. And I can not like a book, but still recommend it based on what I think the student would be interested in.
Right. Do you, when you're both recommending books and bringing books in the classroom, do you only pick from the YA part of the shelf, or do you just not have relevance to, is the work more itself that matters, or do you look to YA maybe first?
I look to YA first, but that could be because that's what I read the most of, and so that's how I'm more awareness of. But like when I recommended Ready Player One's not, even though the protagonist is in his late teenage years, I believe, that's not a young adult book. It's classified as an adult book, and I recommended that to a student. So it all just depends. One of the books that we read the first page of was My Sister's Keeper, which is not a young adult book. It's an adult book with very adult themes, yet the protagonist is young adult, and I've recommended that one in the past too. So it just depends on what I've read and what I think my students would enjoy as well.
How big is your library? Does it span the length of this wall? For those who can't see my wall, like maybe 12 feet?
Well, I have books at home, and then I have books at school, and every now and then each summer I have to go to IKEA and get a new bookshelf, and a lot of times the books go missing. I'll lend out a book and it'll never be brought back.
And that's why you like to have paper books as opposed to the digital ones.
Correct. And if a student forgets to, bring back a book, I hope it's because they really enjoyed it and they kept it. It's not just because they forgot about it and stuck underneath their bed or something, or they pass it on to someone else. Like I'm not, a dictator when it comes to my books, but I have 2 pretty full bookshelves of young adult and other kind of books for students to look at. There's always the school library as well, but mine are kind of more focused and books that I've enjoyed or read. And I love going to like dollar bookstores and looking at the, the kids young adult section and getting books and bringing them back to the classroom as well.
Do you still read Goosebumps?
I a couple of years ago, I picked one up and read it, and
they're making something out of it, a movie or something.
Yeah, the movie came out, I think, last year or the year before.
It already came out?
It already came out and is already on Blu-ray.
You can see how much attention I pay to that.
Yeah. I've gone back to it and read it. It's not the same. Oh. So I recommend anyone that enjoyed a childish book. That's really that's a chapter book. So we're talking late elementary school. But I recommend people who have those amazing memories of those books maybe not go back and read something of so long ago, because it didn't have the magic as it did as an adult. Mm-hmm. But I could see where I still enjoyed it then. And
then you want to hopefully write those books that people will associate with magic later, or even when they're reading them now in life, once it's published and out there and has hopefully in the hands of many, many young adults.
Right. I want to convey a message. I want them to take away a message or take away some aspect that allows them to see their life a little bit differently, or enjoy their life a little bit differently, or even fight with their life a little bit differently. Because I think if a book makes an impact in a positive, neutral, or negative way, as long as it makes an impact, I think that's the importance.
You're looking for that impact, the thing that starts them thinking.
Right.
Conversation.
Right. The dialogue that they have with others or with themselves. I think that's what makes a good book.
And to that point, do you ask a teenager, because you said you've put this in the hands of teenagers before and they'll give you feedback. Do you get anything like that? What kind of, because they don't complain about the voice as far as I can tell. What do they talk to you about?
Sometimes they'll say sometimes it is voice related. It's not that they say that it sounds like an adult, but they would say things like, well, this character wouldn't respond like this, or this character wouldn't describe this as this. And not necessarily, my novel opens with a giant fight scene, and I remember this one girl was interested in reading my book, so after school when I was in the library, I let her read the first couple pages, and she brought up the idea of, I think in the fight scene, it's not a fight scene, it's him just thinking while he's fighting, and when you fight, you're probably not really thinking. And it seemed like such a simplistic comment, yet it was a very important comment because she was right. It was too much of literary me trying to write a fight scene and not letting this competition of strength between 2 adolescent boys, just go. And so I had to go back and redesign the whole beginning chapter off of her comment, because she was right. And so the advice that they give me sometimes helps me, grounds me more, not from being too literary and pulling me back to more kind of a simplistic, this is what happens, and narrate what happens.
Do you think the most rewarding part of your profession? Being where you are now.
Instilling a passion to write and to read, and enjoying books that maybe they wouldn't pick up on their own. I had a student email me over spring break saying, my magical realism short story is at 26 pages. And while that's a good thing, I'm sure there is revision and editing that he can do. So we're going to spend the next week focusing on different ways that one can revise
their piece.
Right. I'm sure everything's important. Yeah, everything's important. That's what I say too. We'll take a look at that. Yeah. But just that idea of someone who looked at the 8 to 12 page, count of I can't do this, and then creating something that's 26 pages. It's very inspiring to me as an educator, and it doesn't just happen with the students who are the A students. This assignment, a lot of times students who aren't very good at writing essays and writing analytically about a piece of literature that we're reading often really thrive in the creative writing aspect. I was reading an article just the other day of this adolescent who got accepted to all these different Ivy League colleges, and she shared her entrance personal statement, and it was a creative writing piece. It was a creative writing piece about her trips as a child to Costco and how that influenced her as a person as she is now. And creative writing, I think, is very important for students, and they need to do more of it. And it's just inspiring when you can instill that passion for writing in someone.
Is there any other aspect of young adult that you'd like to touch on?
I guess my advice, if you're sitting down and wanting to write a story about adolescence, my advice would be, in order to get the voice right, is to just go out to public places. Obviously, I have the experience and that I can just listen in my classroom. But if you walk onto a high school campus and you're not supposed to be there, that could cause some huge concern, right? So my advice would be, go to places that, if you want to write a good, authentic young adult voice, go to places where teenagers hang out. Go to the movies, go to Starbucks, go to the mall, and just kind of listen to their conversations and listen to what they say to each other and how do they respond, and maybe write down some ideas while you're there and get that voice so that way you could be authentic in your own piece of writing. And I think that's what makes the story great. One of the reasons why John Green is so successful in his writing is because he has different YouTube video channels and podcasts, and he can read the comments and he listens to what teenagers say to him back, and he's been on panels, and
he's very involved with the community.
Right. He's involved with the adolescent community and the nerds of the adolescent community, especially in some of his earlier works. And so he's dedicated to them. And if you're going to write a young adult piece and you want to have an authentic voice, you need to be dedicated to that target audience. I feel I am as a teacher, and I try to be the best teacher that I can be, but not everyone's going to have that experience. So get out there and learn something from them.
And that's probably a good idea for those who are not specific to the young adult audience, your science fiction audience, your lit fic audience, whatever genre you're going to, be committed to that community.
Correct. So if you're writing science fiction or fantasy, you better be going to Comic-Con, experiencing what's going on in the world of that. What's cliche, what's not cliche, what is the terminology. For my master's thesis at Chapman University, I've decided to focus on a young adult novel called Ink, Lyrics, and Fur, of these three characters who you wouldn't necessarily think would be friends and they create this comic piece, and one of the characters is actually a furry. And so right now I am exploring the furry fandom as an outsider perspective and going to different events, going to different clubs and interviewing people, because I want to make sure that I portray what furry fandom is in an accurate way. And the only way you can do that is if you kind of put on your investigative journalism hat and you go out and you learn and you write from the perspective.
Do you go as far as to dress up?
No, because then I think I'd be mocking, or I think that would turn into the caricature part. I'm very upfront.
Well, I mean, just to do investigative, see how other people react to you. They'll probably notice what you're doing wrong and what you're doing right.
Right, and so I don't want to fool anyone either. When I talk to people, I let them know, why I'm here.
Are they pretty open with you?
Oh, they're very friendly, very open. Online, it says that I'm what's known as a mundane, because I'm not into the furry fandom and I don't have a fursuit or a fursona. But no one's ever called me mundane in the places that I've gone. So I think that might be a term that's kind of just in print, but they don't actually use. But I've been very well accepted.
People use offensive terms online, and then in person they're not going to call you that.
Right.
Oh, don't call him a mundane.
Yeah. It's like a muggle in the Harry Potter world.
Yeah. It's, although maybe a little bit strong. Yeah, maybe about a little bit stronger than Muggle, because Muggles is kind of just like, matter of fact, that's what they are. I mean, if Hagrid uses it, it can't be that bad, right?
So I'm doing that for my young adult thesis project for my Chapman Masters, for my MFA. But I'm going out and exploring and learning about the subcultures to make sure that I get this character authentic and get the character right.
Very cool. Well, good luck with your Masters.
Thank you. It's a 2-year program. I'm halfway there, so I need to work on. I have applied for my master's, my thesis advisor and all that stuff, and so now I'm just investigating, getting information for the novel that I'm going to write for that. Inklurks and fur.
coming. Well, I mean, I know it's for a project,
Right.
but possibly coming to stores sometime.
Hopefully.
We'll see what happens. There's a lot of unwritten books that stay on a lot of authors' shelves. Let's hope we don't make too many of them.
Right, and I still gotta get Sandstorm out there. I still gotta.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Very
finished.
good luck. How's the editing going?
Editing's going at a small, short pace because I have, I'm
So many
busy,
other responsibilities.
Right, I'm busy with Chapman and I'm busy with teaching, and so, but I'm gradually getting there at editing it, and then I'll send it out. Hopefully, I'll make its way through the slush pile of agents, and hopefully, I can find an agent to pick that up. Which
I'm sure we'll be talking about other podcasts, which people should listen into.
Definitely.
All right. Thank you for coming, Cory.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Come find us at chwritersgroup.org. We are a coffee house writers group, nonprofit organization, and damn proud of it. Come check me out if you would like to be on this podcast. Go ahead and send me a message. Find me on Twitter. I am at jbrianjones, Brian with a Y. Go ahead and find us on Twitter at CHWritersGroup. And on every other form of media, facebook.com/coffeehousewritersgroup. And until next time, go forth and create.